dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose last stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight. O'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets regular, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Order. Arms. Left. Face. Forward. March.
Please remain standing for our invocation by Reverend Barrier.
Would you bow your heads with me today? Jesus, we humbly come before you today. O God, our hope, our refuge, our source of strength. We stand here today remembering that fateful day 17 years ago. We come to remember those who lost their lives in New York City, Washington, D.C., the fields of Somerset County, Pennsylvania. We stand here today to remember those public servants who gave the ultimate sacrifice, just as you did, and they laid their lives down for others. Although we stand here remembering today, we also stand here in hope. Hope that is not in ourselves, hope that is not in our own wisdom and knowledge, but hope that is in you and you alone. We pray today for the protection and for the guidance of this great nation, this great city, this great state, and all of its leaders. We pray a hedge of protection around our law enforcement, our fire department, and all of our public servants. And as we commemorate this tragedy today, we give you thanks for your presence in our time of need. And I'm asking that you would be with us, you would guide us and direct us today, and wrap your arms around us. We give thanks, and we ask all these things in the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
You may be seated. Chief Kling.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for spending some time with us today. Just as the pastor said, 17 years ago was a solemn moment for not just this community, but the entire nation. And we vowed at that point that we would never forget, and we won't forget. And we're going to continue to do this from now on, because it's more important now than it is and has been in the past. I was talking to a community group just a little while ago this morning, and I was talking about a few things. And one thing I asked is, can you spend some time by coming out today to see this event and to spend some time here? And I looked at a couple of things and that came off the top of my head. And the first thing is I asked, have you ever been to the Lincoln Memorial? And a few people said they had. And I asked them, have you read the inscription on the wall written at the Lincoln Memorial? And if you have, how impactful was it? And if it wasn't impactful, then take a 90-minute trip to Pennsylvania to look at Gettysburg and go through the tour to realize exactly what occurred in this nation under President Lincoln and the direction that the country was headed in and the resiliency of what occurred after the Battle at Gettysburg and throughout the entire South. And then I asked the question about today, and I said, December the 7th, what does that mean to us? And December the 7th today often goes unforgotten, or forgotten, I should say, because December the 7th now is just passing as a day. But it was another turn for this nation when Pearl Harbor was bombed by the enemy that we had at the time. And then I asked the question about September the 11th, 2001, and we vowed never to forget. And yet I asked about how many American flags do you see on people's cars driving throughout communities the way it was shortly after that. And once again, we look and see that things have been, it's the past and we've forgotten. And I know one thing about this great nation, the turmoil that we're in, constantly looking forward to developing the democracy that we have sets us apart from any nation in the world. It's never going to be that nation that is going to be perfect, but as the late Judge Scalia said during one of his meetings with Congress, and that was that it was never designed for it to be clean. The democracy that we have is supposed to be messy at best, but it's what sets us apart. And I would ask that you think about those three instances in life that some of my grandparents, obviously, and that generation dealt with during the situation at Pearl Harbor. Certainly what happened prior to that helped shape this nation and what we represent at Gettysburg. And then what happened to us on September the 11th, 2001, that puts us to where we are today. The crosses on your left and your right represent the individuals that gave their life, not including the folks that gave their lives that just went to work as everyday Americans with the idea that nothing like this would have ever happened in this country, but it did. And I used my opportunity this morning to explain to the citizens that I spoke with that we can't let the distant past not be forgotten because of what's coming. And the unfortunate reality, just as those three situations or incidents that I've talked about, God forbid anything happens to this nation again, but we want to be certainly in remembrance that that's what helps shapes us. That's the resiliency of this nation and all the citizens that represent this wonderful country. During the national anthem, I looked at the flag. That flag gets decimated constantly. People make fun of it. People in other nations don't respect it. People here don't respect it. And the unfortunate reality is day in and day out, citizens in this country give their life, they'll lay their life on the line to ensure that the freedoms that all of us represent in this nation are represented in that flag. And again, it's never going to be that situation that's going to be perfect, but it's what defines us as a nation. So I just want to, as my opening comments, I want to at least get that out to us to understand that it is important. It's going to continue to be important. We will not forget. And as a nation, we will just continue to get stronger, even if it's in small gatherings like this across the entire nation. So thank you very much for spending a little bit of time for us. I want to quickly recognize the dignitaries that are in the audience. The first is our mayor, honorable mayor for the city of Rialto, Deborah Robertson. Mayor. Next is our Mayor Pro Tem, Ed Scott. Our City Treasurer, Ed Carrillo. Thank you for your service. Our State Assemblywoman, Eloise Reyes, represented by Daniel Peden. And at this time, it's my honor to introduce a colleague of mine who shares some commonality in the fact that public servants lost their life that day. I just want to bring up to the podium our Fire Chief, Sean Grayson.
Good morning. I really am honored to stand before you representing both the City of Rialto and the men and women of the Rialto Fire Department. Some of them are behind you and to your side. Hopefully they're not distracting. Most of them have more hair than me, so I'll stay out of the glare of the sunlight. But the fire service shares with America the never forget motto. It encapsulates that more than 3,000 people died on September 11th, and 343 firefighters were killed attempting to save them. The 343 lost firefighters are displayed on the back of your Rialto fire truck behind me, and the motto never forget is on the side of all of your Rialto fire engines. But how can we truly never forget if a third of America isn't old enough to remember the events of September 11, 2001? Memories fade, but our resolve to acknowledge our history and to keep it alive must not. The high school class of 2019, the seniors that will graduate next year from Eisenhower, Carter, and Rialto High, were infants or maybe not even born on that horrible day. That day when planes hit the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a field in Pennsylvania. The key to keeping our history alive and resolve alive is telling the stories of that day. Telling stories not just of the tragedy, although that is important, but the stories of the people who rose on the occasion. Police, firefighters, first responders, and equally as important, everyday men and women who saved friends, family members, co-workers, and absolute strangers during their greatest time of need, becoming the heroes that America is known for. Over the last several years on this day, I've shared with you stories of the heroes of that day, not the police, fire, and first responders, but the everyday people that saved so many. Benjamin Keith Clark was a chef working for the Fiduciary Trust Company on the 98th floor of the World Trade Center South Tower. He was serving breakfast to 258 employees when American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower. He jumped into action, trying to get everyone out, evacuating everyone he could. He'd later be credited with saving more than 300 lives. All the occupants of the 96th floor made it safely out of the building, save Mr. Clark. He'd stopped on the 78th floor to assist a woman in a wheelchair while the rest of his company proceeded out. He perished when United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. There are many stories of courage like that of Benjamin Keith Clark from 9/11. He sacrificed everything, but saved hundreds of lives in doing so. His mother, Elsie Clark, suggests that he would not have had it any other way. He was a former Marine, and he'd probably be bothered by me saying former Marine. Thank you for your service. But in that capacity, he sought to protect those who could not protect themselves. His wife, LaShawn Clark, will tell you that he's still with us today in the hundreds of people that he saved and the 5 children he left behind, who have gone on to tremendous lives because of its influence and heroism. In 1981, at his first inaugural address, President Ronald Reagan posited, "Above all, we must realize that no arsenal, or no weapon in the arsenals of the world, is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women. It is a weapon our adversaries in today's world do not have." While President Reagan could not know the horrors of September 11, 2001, he himself came from the generation that lived through and thrived in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. This sentiment that he expressed led his generation and would ultimately lead the generation that came of age in the aftermath of 9/11, including those that committed themselves to protect America's greatest history and to ensure that America would remain the land of the free and the home of the brave. The greatest act of terrorism against the United States galvanized the concept of service in a generation that was coming of age at the time of the attack. The generation nearing adulthood in 2001 that volunteered, fought, and even perished to protect this great nation. This sentiment of service before self is ever present in Rialto's finest and Rialto's bravest, those men and women who serve this city every day as your police officers and your firefighters. In order to keep the flame of our resolve from 9/11 alive, I'm proud to bring up someone who shares a unique story. A story of how watching planes crash into towers on September 11th, 17 years ago, propelled him into a service before self career with the city of Rialto. I would like to introduce to you one of Rialto's newest firefighter paramedics, Anthony Killian.
Thank you very much, Chief. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. 9/11 is a day that many of us remember as a day that changed our lives, changed our state, our neighborhoods, and our country as a whole. Some of us may have realized the effect that this day had on our friends and coworkers, especially the loved ones that lost somebody from the devastating events that transpired that morning. I know that personally those events changed me. I remember sitting in class that morning and hearing what had happened. I remember the fear that was placed in each individual across this nation knowing that we were under attack. At the time of the attack, I was only 14 years old. I was a freshman in high school and a brand new fire explorer with the Orange County Fire Authority. That night, I attended drill at Fire Station 31, and that evening, I learned of all the men and women that paid the ultimate sacrifice trying to save others. It made me question if this career was right for me and if I had what it took to fill the boots of those that came before me. Flash forward 4 years from that, and I was on a plane to boot camp just a few months out of high school. I served as a combat firefighter in deployments supporting both Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom. I was able to work alongside some of the best and bravest men and women this country has to offer, and unfortunately, they didn't all make it back with me to our families. I've seen the long-term impact that this day has had on our world. I've seen our communities come together for good, and I've seen patriotism in this country rise. I stand here before you today as a probationary firefighter for this city of Rialto. I've continued to follow this career path as a firefighter in order to commemorate and honor all these men and women you see before you that sacrificed their life for their neighbors. Let us never forget this day, and let us pay our respects for those who are lost that faithful morning. Thank you very much.
It's my honor and privilege to introduce to you a Rialto resident, a 9/11 historian of sorts, and a retired lieutenant from the Rialto Police Department, one of Rialto's finest, Kathy Thompson.
Good morning. It is a great honor again for me to be with you on Patriot Day. Please stand and join me in a moment of silence for those that we lost on September 11th, 2001. Please be seated. It's only natural, I think, that we would anchor on where we were and what we were doing when we learn of significant historical events. For me, the first time that I recall that happening was on November 22nd, 1963. I was an 11-year-old kid in a 6th grade classroom, and I remember every single detail about what happened that day. I remember my teacher abruptly leaving our classroom and then returning a few minutes later to tell us, with tears streaming down his face, that President Kennedy had been assassinated. And just like every one of you, I remember where I was and what I was doing the moment that I learned that our great nation had been attacked on September 11th, 2001. September 11th started out much like today. It was a Tuesday. The skies were crystal blue. The air was clear and crisp. It was almost autumn. And when I close my eyes today and let my mind wander back to that morning, I can still see myself getting in my uniform and getting ready to go to work. I can smell breakfast cooking in our kitchen. And I can hear the loud, long alert tones of my husband's pager as it activated to tell him that something significant had happened somewhere. I can hear Terry calling out from the living room that something had happened in New York City. "Turn on the TV," he hollered. "A plane has crashed into the World Trade Center." And what started out as a normal Tuesday for all of us, it would change all of our lives forever. September 11th was a day that shook the very foundation of America. Much, I suspect, like December 7th, 1941 had done a generation before. It was a day that would leave thousands dead. And it was a day that would cause many Americans to learn to hate. But it was also a day that united our country as never before. And although those horrible images from that morning are still difficult to look at even today, 17 years later, there are so many images that I want to remember. The images of strangers helping strangers under the most unimaginable of circumstances. And images of our Congress that sadly today is so divided on just about every issue. On that day, they were absolutely united. And they stood united for all to witness on the steps of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. And our nation, our neighborhoods, 3,000 miles wide, that had stood so very plain the day before, now awash in red, white, and blue, as they were decorated from door to door to door with American flags. 2,977 innocent lives were taken that day in cold blood. When 19 terrorists hijacked 4 planes, we saw images, the world saw images that will be ingrained in our mind's eye for the rest of our lives. The North Tower at the World Trade Center in New York City was the first struck by the hijacked American Airlines Flight 11 at 8:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then 17 minutes later, the South Tower at the World Trade Center was struck by the hijacked United Airlines Flight 175 at 9:03 a.m. Unbelievably, a third hijacked airliner, American Airlines Flight 77, was flown into the Pentagon at 9:37. And 4 minutes after the South Tower collapsed, the hijacked United Airlines Flight 93 crashed into the Pennsylvania countryside near a town called Shanksville at 10:03. Within 25 minutes, the North Tower would also collapse. Among the nearly 3,000 victims killed on September 11th, 403 were my public safety brothers and sisters. 60 were from New York's finest, her police officers, with 23 from the NYPD and 37 from her Port Authority. And then there was the staggering number we've already heard about this morning, 343 who were New York's bravest, her firefighters and her paramedics. From the fatal wounds that came from the stories of the 4 airliners came incalculable stories of heroism. Firefighters, police officers, paramedics, and emergency medical technicians. We saw them stand shoulder to shoulder and work side by side with office workers, taxi cab drivers, the clergy, the grocer, the teacher, the nurse, and countless others to rescue those who were trapped in the rubble and the fires. At past 9/11 memorials, I have spoken of the heroism of Lieutenant Terry Tobin of the NYPD. She continued her rescue efforts to save others' lives, even though she herself had suffered life-threatening injuries that later would take 80 stitches to close. A fractured ankle, a bruised kidney, and permanent hearing loss. And she did that before she sought medical treatment for her own injuries. And I've also spoken in the past of Ronald Bucca. He was a fire marshal with the Fire Department of New York. He was killed on 9/11. But in his heroic efforts, he climbed 1,482 steps in his attempts to save others before he lost his own life when the tower collapsed. His remains remained in that building's rubble for another 42 days until they were recovered on October 23rd. He was a shining example of an extraordinary devotion to duty. And I ask you this morning to reflect on the magnitude of that number, 1,482 steps. I don't know about you, but I can't imagine climbing that many steps on a normal morning, let alone under the circumstances with which he was faced that morning. 1,482 steps. The word hero, it's a tiny word, just 4 letters, but it is a giant of a word in its true meaning. And as we reflect on September 11th, 2001, please open your hearts and your ears this morning to the heroic stories of 2 more of the bravest and finest that New York City held in her arms that morning. America's finest. Officer Moira Smith, badge number 10467, a 13-year veteran of the NYPD, married to a police officer, and the mother of a 2-year-old daughter. On the morning of September 11th, she was working a detail in Manhattan when her attention was drawn to the sound of an approaching airliner. It sounded different to her than the many planes that flew over Manhattan every day. This one sounded louder and lower. And as she looked up, Officer Smith saw American Airlines Flight 11 just as it slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. She is credited as the first officer to report what had just happened via a radio broadcast, as she and others headed that direction. Shortly after, a photographer snapped an often published picture of Officer Smith as she was leading a bleeding businessman to safety. She returned into that building, and it was her efforts to rescue people then that caused her to be called the woman with the flashlight. Martin Glenn credits Officer Smith with not only saving his life, but saving the lives of hundreds of others as they made their way from the 82nd floor along a ramp to a downward escalator that connected them to an underground passageway that they were using to exit the building. There stood Officer Smith at the end of that ramp. She had her flashlight in her hand and she was waving it like a baton. She kept repeating over and over, "Don't look, keep moving. Don't look, keep moving." Mr. Glenn has said that Officer Smith's calm attention to the situation is what led him and those hundreds of other people out of that building to safety. He tried to look past her out into the plaza, and as he did so, as he leaned one way, she mirrored his motion and blocked his vision, saying, "Don't look, keep moving." He said that their eyes locked, and when his eyes were full of questions, her eyes spoke to him with knowledge and pain. They told him everything he needed to know. This is a horrible situation. Keep moving and get out of here. He said that she was in control and she insulated the evacuees from the awareness of just how bad the situation really was. I envision that just as she had directed traffic as a street cop time and time again with that flashlight, she now used it to direct those hundreds of people out of that building to safety. She had exited the building. She was safe. And just like Ronald Bucca had done before, she also re-entered the building. And in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of that tower, there was a brief radio transmission of a female officer calling for help. That recorded voice was later identified as Officer Moira Smith. She perished when the tower fell. Her remains were recovered on March 20th, 2002. She was one of my sister police officers, and truly one of America's finest. America's bravest. I've said before at 9/11 memorials that it was really hard for me to find written accounts of the heroism that we all know that New York's bravest performed on the morning of September 11th. I learned that they are uncomfortable with that tiny word, hero. They will tell you nonchalantly that they're just doing their job and that they can't imagine doing anything else, but they're just doing their job. But I submit to you that when things are going horribly wrong and a firefighter arrives at your door, the words we often speak are, "Thank God you're here." America's bravest puts themselves in harm's way every day across our nation, most times for people that they never knew. Yes, heroes. Engine 54, Ladder 4, Battalion 9 in Midtown Manhattan. They suffered the greatest firehouse loss on September 11th. They lost 15 members. And every 9/11, they ring their firehouse bell 15 times to honor their memory. And then they go about their day doing their duty, answering 14,000 calls every year. Yes, heroes in every sense of the word. Today, I share with you the story of just one of New York's bravest on the morning of September 11th. Stephen Siller was a firefighter with Brooklyn Squad 1. He was the youngest of 7 children, orphaned at the age of 9, married, and the father of 5. He was just 34 years old. On the morning of September 11th, he had just finished his shift for the week. He was headed on his days off. He was on his way to meet his brothers for a round of golf on one of the last days of summer 2001. He had a scanner with him, and he heard that the plane had crashed into the World Trade Center. So he called his wife and he asked her to get a hold of his brothers and tell them that he was going to be a few minutes late and that he would catch up with them later on the golf course. He then went to his station where he gathered up his gear and headed towards the World Trade Center. But when he got to the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, he found that the tunnel had already been closed to vehicular traffic. Was that going to let him stop his mission? No. What did he do? He abandoned his truck, put that 60 pounds on his back, and he raced through the tunnel toward the Twin Towers. It's known that about 3/4 of the way through the tunnel, he was picked up by Engine Company 239, who then took him to Ground Zero, where sadly, he lost his life trying to save the lives of others. Now his memory lives on as every year hundreds of others run the path that he ran that morning through the tunnel toward the Twin Towers, many with 60 pounds strapped on their backs as they run the Stephen Siller Tunnel to Towers 5K to honor and support first responders. One of Stephen's friends has said that every momentous event, even a tragedy, has its symbolic figures. And September 11th was no different. It just had more of them. Rudy Giuliani, Father Michael Judge, the 4 civilian heroes on United Flight 93, 100 more, 1,000 more, and none of them bigger than Stephen Siller and his selfless act that morning when he put himself back on duty, when the call of duty beckoned him on a day when he should have been somewhere else. His favorite quote was from St. Francis of Assisi: "While we have time, let us do good." Stephen Siller is truly one of America's bravest. In closing, President Bush said shortly after the attacks on September 11th, "Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve." And today, as we remember that most terrible of days, I believe that nothing can dent the steel of America's resolve if we remain one nation under God and indivisible. Let us always remember the 2,977 kind and loving souls who perished that day, and let us always remember the tremendous acts of heroism by public safety personnel who ran into the World Trade Center towers as everyone else was running out of them. God bless each and every one of you as you go about your day today, and may God bless our beloved United States of America. Thank you.
My colleague up here. So first of all, I just want to thank Terry and Kathy Thompson for another not just history lesson, but some memorable information that all of us can take with us today. Thank you very much for the time and effort you put into the research and also for helping us understand just a small but huge magnitude of situations that were happening that day. Thank you very much. On behalf of the City of Rialto, we are both blessed to be public servants here, along with everyone here that's in uniform, those civilians that make this city what it is, our city leadership. And I just want to thank, on behalf of them, that we appreciate your time, your interest, and please go about your day today and let this day not be forgotten and speak about it. It's something that we need to be constantly reminded about. The mere fact that Kathy talked about resolve. This is a tremendous nation. It's got so much more potential that we can only continue to learn from the past and just make us that much stronger. Chief?
There's a rule, never speak after Chief Kling, but so I'll make it brief. He said everything important with one exception. It's an amazing thing, and it's a lot of hard work for the crosses that you see in honor of the fallen police officers and firefighters to your left and to your right. And that is done solely based on the hard work of your police volunteers. They're not going to tell you who they are. They're standing in the back, and they don't want any acknowledgement. But it is an amazing thing that the City of Rialto does, and thank you very much to all those that make that happen.
So do us a favor. Instead of just getting up and walking to your cars, why don't you spend a few minutes to get acquainted with one another, talk a little bit, spend some time with your public servants, your firefighters, your police officers, all your volunteers. Take some time to enjoy not just this city, what it has to offer, but also in remembrance, like the chief said, of the crosses on either side of the street. Thank you very much. Be safe. God bless. We'll talk to you all soon.